Chris, thanks for being here with me today. We're going to talk a little bit about background checks in Safe Sanctuaries, and I know that you've had a lot of experience in Safe Sanctuaries, so we're glad you're here to share some with us today.
I'm glad to be here also. I hope that what we talk about is really worthwhile.
So we know that background checks are important. That's the one thing we do know about Safe Sanctuaries. Will you offer the reasoning behind the importance of conducting background checks?
Absolutely. Conducting background checks is really a risk reduction tool. It also is something that gives a church staff, youth director, children's director, sort of a window on volunteers or other folks that would serve in their ministry that would be full of information that people wouldn't necessarily normally provide.
You know, a lot of times there are churches that don't think that background checks are necessary. And, we know this person, we all know each other, we've been in church together forever. How would you talk to them about doing background checks and the importance of background checks?
I guess I would approach it in a couple of different ways. One of them is that, that performing a background check has nothing to do with judgment of character or anything like that. That's the part of knowing somebody that is in your congregation and is a fellow follower of Christ. That there's not going to be any judgment that goes along with doing a background check. One of the things that it really positively affects is insurance rates for the church and insurability and safety for all those that participate in church events. And in fact, church insurance is one of those things that's very, very important to be able to carry.
Right.
And background checks are one thing that can help not only keep costs down, but also show that you, as a church staff, are doing your due diligence to make sure that you're caring for all sorts of vulnerable populations.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Chris. How far back should we go with background checks for someone new to ministry with children, youth, and vulnerable adults? And then how often should we do background checks after that?
Sure. There are various levels of background checks. I would recommend going back at least 5, sometimes 7 years, as you do criminal background checks especially. I would engage different services. There's several services that are out there, state, local, as well as kind of some federal ones. There's also options to do financial background checks. I don't think you need to go nearly as far back as those, but when you're looking for criminal records and driving records, looking at least for the last 5 years is a very, very good thing to be able to do. Also then, in terms of the updating question, really, if you have somebody who's an active volunteer or servant in your ministry, you really should try to re-up the background check every 2 years. And that's for several reasons. Again, it all has to do with risk reduction again. And it usually has to do with perhaps somebody's nervousness about sharing something that may have happened in the course of life or something like that. And I could point to something like a DUI or driving under the influence or driving while intoxicated. It could be something that didn't harm anyone else necessarily, but something that they got picked up and they have a charge on their driver's license. How would I be able to bring that up, proactively with the people that I'm volunteering with? Probably not very easily. I might be very nervous about that, especially because I might feel judged. I might feel like I might lose my ability to serve in the way that I have been. And so if you have somebody that isn't going to be proactive with something negative that has happened on their record, keeping those background checks updated is very helpful.
So how do we, we have all these different ministries that are short-term and activities that are short-term that we have to pull in a lot of people to help serve in those ministries, like Vacation Bible School. So how do we do background checks or do we do background checks for short period ministries?
That's a great question. In a perfect world, I would say, you background check everybody that you possibly can, no matter how they are serving. Knowing that there are realities of time and of budget, because it does cost money to run background checks and kind of keep up those services. There are some kind of workarounds and some creative ways I've found of still meeting the background check requirements when doing short-term activities. Vacation Bible School, fortunately, that's usually a larger crowd. You've got multiple volunteers, right. You've got multiple, families and lots of children and youth that are there to serve as well and participate. So one of the things that you can do is make sure that you have at least one core background checked adult, and then pair the non-background check folks up with that person who's background checked, making sure that you always have at least 2 or 3 different unrelated adults together. And usually you would want to allow those non-background check folks to serve either in places that don't have direct contact with youth or children, like being on the meal crew, helping create snacks and all that good food stuff that I know is super important for my Vacation Bible School experience. Or putting them in places where it's a public setting, putting them like on the games team, where there's not really a large chance of them being in a one-on-one situation with a child. Related to youth, I would think of mission trips as another short-term ministry opportunity. And that's one that I don't think there's a workaround for it. I think you really need to do a background check that everybody who goes on a mission trip or service expedition, you just need to do it. Because the chances of you ending up in a one-on-one situation or a less than public situation are greatly increased when you're spending overnights as a group, when you're working in places that are not familiar. And when you've got chances of emergencies happening, say you have a youth on a trip who gets injured and needs to be brought to a medical facility of some kind, you probably can't sacrifice 2 adults all the time to be able to do that. So how do you take 1 adult, send them along with an ambulance crew, or how do you create some transparency in medical situations?
So Chris, are there any other best practices that you would share with us on background checks and Safe Sanctuaries?
A handful of them. One thing that folks are very concerned about related to background checks is privacy of information. And so a best practice is to keep copies of the background checks in a very secure location within the church. Make sure that you are not the only person on staff that knows where those are. And also keep them kind of in a shared file. It would make sense to me that if you're at a church that has ministry models where you've got children's ministry and youth ministry and different things, go ahead and work with the staff to figure out one single location to keep all of the background checks on file. If you're able to do some sort of electronic tracking to remind yourself of when the 2-year window comes up, to revamp and re-up your background checks, go ahead and set those up. Or pick like a standard time of the year when you do background check updates. I know for me, when I was at my local church, the 2 big events that we had were mission trips in the summertime, and then we did a big fall kickoff. And so in preparation for fall kickoff, that was always a great time for me to update my background check files at the same time as I was updating my notarized medical information cards for my kids.
Good idea.
And that kind of a thing.
Yeah, great suggestion. Well, Chris, it's been great having conversation with you today. And I think that a lot of people will benefit from what you've shared. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Melanie.
You're a blessing to the church, Chris.